But at the same time, this imposter syndrome going, I have no clue what I'm doing. And I feel like that's been the story of my life. I think God's put me in positions and asked me to step into things that I'd never felt equipped to do, partly because I think he knows my personality. If I put my hand to anything, I'm going to work to become the best at it. And I think that can quickly lead to going, I have this because of me, because I did this and I've worked for it and I'm the best at it. So God's always put me in spaces where it made no sense. And that was one of them.
This is the Made to Advance podcast. I'm your host, Brian Aulick. We're here to inspire and equip you for your best future. Well, I'm really looking forward to the conversation we've got today because Lungz Makaula is on the show. And Lungz is a pastor of SOZO City Church in Chicago, Illinois. And he is one of the finest pastors I know. We are privileged to have him on Made to Advance. And so, Lungz, welcome.
I love it. I love it. I'm glad to be here. Let's have ourselves a good day.
It's good day. I'm surprised. Like, you just got done preaching two services.
Boy, that was fun.
And I gave you the out. I said, hey, if you want to just pass today, it's okay because you're going to be speaking tonight too. And you're like, let's do this.
My yes is my yes.
There it is.
There it is.
So here we are.
And let's get real. I wasn't sure if I'd ever get invited to this, so I'm glad I'm here.
Yeah, well, we'll decide. We'll decide if you're getting invited back. But you've definitely been invited.
Or if it even is. So let's talk about it.
Well, first, I love just hearing people's backgrounds. So,
right.
And you've got a really interesting story that, if somebody said, oh, what's your even professional background before, doing what you're doing today, they'd never guess. But go way back. Tell us where you were born. I think people are hearing your voice right now thinking, I don't think he's from Idaho, but I'm not sure where. So.
That's what I tell everybody. I'm from Texas. So I was born in South Africa. So what's interesting about South Africa is I was born in 91. Now, if you know your history, I might have told you this story, I don't remember, but 91 is pretty much towards the back end of South Africa's apartheid. It was only, I think, 3 years before Nelson Mandela was released from prison. So that is what I was born into. My mum was one of 8 children. She had just got back. It's funny, I had an old passport of hers, and she had just got back from Australia. So I was almost born in Australia.
No kidding.
But what's crazy is I've gone full circle because I was born in South Africa, grew up there, loved upbringing, but wasn't a Christian home. I was the first Christian in my family, gave my life to Jesus about 16 or 17 years old. My friend of mine, Tim, I often tell a story of Tim. Tim was a sports friend of mine. We'd played sports together forever, and he never mentioned Jesus or the gospel to me one time. I got injured and got miraculously healed from, I got paralyzed playing rugby. That was my thing.
Kidding.
I wanted to be if you're in South Africa, you want to be a professional rugby player.
Yeah.
And that's what I wanted to do. Got paralyzed and was in hospital, got miraculously healed, and 6 months out of it, and Tim took me to church and I heard the gospel and my life changed. But I often say, don't be a Tim. I say, what took you so long to tell me the greatest news ever? And so that has what really framed even my own stance on evangelism. I am a passionate soul winner. So I led my brother to the Lord. I led my mother to the Lord. I led most of my cousins to the Lord. And so that set me on course.
How did you end up getting healed? What was that? How did that all play out?
I had someone come pray for me at the hospital.
Okay.
And lay hands on me. And I can't explain the feeling. There's certain things that happen to you that are miraculous you can't put words to. And sometimes I'm okay with that because I think if we can find language for everything that's spiritual, then does God seem so magnificent, So that was my experience. So
did you know the person or
yeah, it was a friend of mine.
Okay.
It was a friend of mine who, again, similar, faith-based, just knew the Lord but never told me about it. And so now I go, man, if we're gonna really live this thing out, we're gonna tell everyone we know. Yeah. And so it frames how I live.
I love that. I love that in part because, I was just with our staff doing this teaching on miracles. One of the interesting things was I looked up at all the different verses in the New Testament that talk about not narratives of miracles taking place, but that talk about people praying for miracles or the purpose of miracles. And what really was shocking to me is I think a lot of times when we pray and ask for miracles, it's because we see a need, we have compassion, we need, we're like, God, would you help this person? What was interesting is hands down the number one theme behind the presence and the purpose of miracles was to authenticate and confirm the gospel message preached. And that surprised me. That's verse after verse. I was showing the team that. Well, what's interesting with you saying you've got this passion for evangelism is in a very real way, I feel like you experienced a miracle, and now the way that's working out in your life is exactly the way it's supposed to, biblically speaking, which is where you're giving witness out of the miracle, and not just giving gratitude. As important as that is, of course, you want to say, "Thank God, I'm healed." But I love that.
I think there was actually a pretty major pivot for me, because you're right. A lot of it in the early days came from me having experienced firsthand the power of God. So a lot of my faith was built on the signs and wonders. And I remember a teacher, one of my guys who was one of the teaching pastors. He said, "Hey," because I encouraged him, "Hey, how will you get your faith stirred by these stories?" We did praise reports. He's like, "Hey, just correct you. Faith doesn't come by signs and wonders. Faith comes by hearing the word of God." And that was, again, a pivotal moment to go, okay, I've got to rebuild again my expectation of seeing miracles and signs and wonders and seeing people, soul saved, not because I've seen God do miracles, but because I know out of what the word says, God can do in the life of a sinner. So my faith has really been built out of the word rather than what I've seen.
Yeah, that's so good. So when you're growing up in an apartheid context, how did that? Well, how long were you in South Africa?
Till 17, 18.
Okay, so that's fully your world.
Most of my.
How did that context affect your growing up? Affect your worldview, etc.?
I mean, your entire environment. It really does shape your experiences. So, my mom was a single parent. I was. I think 7 generations in my family of fatherlessness, which is the epidemic, I think, in Africa that we don't really talk about much. So didn't grow up with a dad. An interesting thing about my mom is that most of her family put their resources together to send her to Europe to get an education. So she got her education in London. Because of the apartheid situation, they were going to get a good education. So our entire family's disposition, because of my mom, when she got back and apartheid ended, and she was one of the few Black women, let alone Black people, but Black women to be able to be a successful businesswoman, she's always had this burden. Again, it's part of our upbringing culture. We look after our own, which again is so one of our values: loyalty and caring for people in my world. I will bend over backwards. There is no ask too great that I won't fulfill. So that was, again, something that informed how I live. Generosity is central to who I am. So my mom was able to pay for most of her sisters or siblings' kids to go to school, their houses, her mum's house. And we've always had this burden to go, we look after people who've looked after us. So that framed that. I've often grown up being the only Black person in most spaces, my schooling, the neighborhood we lived in, because again, there was a disparity in everything. So
your mom's income allowed you, even in South Africa, lived into a largely white neighborhood because of she could afford to.
She could afford to because she got an education out of the country.
Yeah.
So that framed a lot of even my upbringing. Because again, you get into spaces now, people think that because legislation changes, the human heart changes, which that's not the case.
Right.
I think South Africa still went through a couple of years where I think people were slowly adopting to the idea. So I still very much grew up and people resistant to change. So I was often in spaces where I didn't feel like I belonged there. So that my work ethic comes from that. My desire for excellence comes from that. If people often mistake it for people pleasing. No, I have a drive to always be the very best at what I do, because I realized that I was living in spaces and doing things that weren't afforded to everybody else. And I think when you have a revelation of that, understanding that this life is a gift and the things that we have are not necessarily afforded to everybody, it's shaped everything for me. So work ethic, excellence, drive, this pursuit of perfection kind of framed my upbringing and frames a lot of what I do now. That's why I'm an 8 type.
Yeah, well, that's so good, because I think it's one thing when you see people who are hard workers, who have a high standard of excellence, there are all kinds of things that can drive that. There can be a desire, I just want monetary rewards. I want recognition.
Right.
I am a perfectionist and I only feel good when I'm, have top quality results. And what really, I would say, gospel-driven work ethic and gospel-driven desire for excellence, it really does ultimately come from an experience of what God has done for you, first and chiefly through Jesus, but then also reflecting on your life as you have and saying, look at all he's given me. Yeah. How can I respond in any other way but then to give him my best? And that's what I hear in your life. That's a freeing way to have drive and excellence, because as we know, any other motivation on the inside is going to lead to tyranny.
That's right, and it's not for the praise of man. It's not for the pursuit of anything else. It's funny. My wife, we did a couple of years ago. The 5 love languages came out.
Oh yeah.
I was like, well, none of them resonate with me, And she's like, you've got to be one of the most confident people I've ever met. And I was like, well, a lot of what drives me is not what comes from without. It's what comes from within. My drive is internal. And I think when I came to know Christ, it wasn't the drive to excel. It was really now the drive to Colossians to do everything as unto the Lord. I don't do anything half-hearted. I'm either in or I'm out. And I think that's also why I love golf so much, because golf really is a game where it's you against you, you against you and that little white ball. And so that is the story of my life. So it's funny, encouragement doesn't really hardly anything for me. I appreciate it. I'll thank you for your kind words, but it's not the driving force behind why I do what I do. I think now, as I've grown as a believer, it's scriptures like the gifts and talents that are given to the people of God. If one was given 5, one was given 2, are you going to be a steward of what you've been given? Do everything as unto the Lord. Those are the driving factors now behind why I do what I do.
Yeah, so good.
So people are like, and part of the downside of that, you'll see it, is that, and I think you might be similar, but you're better than I am at celebrating. I don't celebrate much. So now I've intentionally surrounded myself with people who don't take life too seriously. And part of that is Australians will do that to you. They'll make you realize that life isn't all that crazy. Enjoy it. So now I'm able to celebrate more and have a much better time doing what we do.
It's funny because I on the one hand, I'm ready always for the next thing.
Yep.
But I really do love celebrating. And I think partially the joy of, like when we launched Made to Advance.
Yes.
I got the team together right afterwards. We'd put all this time in. There'd been all kinds of prep and process and whatnot. And then, we probably had that date 3 months out for the party, the launch party, or 2 months out. I don't know. Justin remember, but
opening episode.
Yeah, and it was like, so I think we posted the opening episode, and then the following Monday we had a lunch, and it was just a chance to celebrate, look what God's done and whatnot.
Fair enough.
So you're 16 or 17 through your South Africa days growing up, and then what prompts the move? Tell us about that.
So I started working for Ernst & Young. So sports went off the table. And it's funny enough, I initially wanted to be an orthopedic surgeon because I'd had so many surgeries from playing rugby. My orthopedic surgeon and I probably had the closest relationship that any patient should have with their doctor. So I wanted to be an orthopedic surgeon, so I applied for medical school and got accepted. But then I realized, so what my orthopedic surgeon did, he sent me a video of one of my surgeries. He's like, oh, this is, he sent me this dry man. He's like, here's a video of you. You can watch it and be inspired.
Yeah.
I watched it. Threw up, realized I can't do it because I don't stand blood. So changed.
That's a drawback.
Pivoted roles real quick, pivoted careers, and decided accounting is what I wanted to do.
Okay.
And so
you get a lot of that these days. People that thought surgery and then think accounting as the natural next step.
Well, I mean, part of that drive was going, okay, well, I've got to take on the mantle from my mother. Because she was supporting a large chunk of our family, not just our immediate family, but our extended family. And my brother was a bit of a wild card. He's a crack up, but was never gonna be able to do what she did in terms of supporting. So I knew that fell on me. So a lot of my decision making was seen through the lens of how do I pick up the mantle of serving my family.
Yeah.
So it had to be a career that was going to be well paying. So that was the driving factor, actually. It wasn't even a passion thing. In fact, I was a late bloomer in school. I was terrible all the way through until 11th grade, and then the lights came on. And so that was the driving factor. So that's why accounting.
So you did university in South Africa.
Yeah, that's right.
And then straight to Australia.
That's right.
For Ernst & Young, which is one of the, at the time,
top four global firm.
Okay, yeah, it's funny because I've got enough age on you that when I was in business school, it was like I think it was Big 6 or Big 7 they called it, but now it's Big 4. Big 4 is all it's,
KPMG, PwC, Deloitte, and Ernst & Young. So I was the youngest employee at Ernst & Young, South Africa, then transferred to Australia. So I mean,
what was that like as a young person to start? And it's just you, nobody from your family, right?
No, just me.
What was it like to start over in a new country?
Well, when you grow up in the kind of circumstances I grew up in, challenges our family faced, you learn resilience pretty quickly. And really, I grew up very early. So a lot of people who meet me have often said that I'm more mature I'm more mature for my age. And that's just because I grew up early. You know, my mom, I remember a very distinct conversation I had with my mother at 16. She said, well, now you're an adult now and you've got to hold your own. I mean, these are conversations that some people aren't even having at age 30.
Right.
I'm having at 16, you got 30-year-olds still living with their parents trying to figure out what I want to do with my life. At 16, I was like, okay, I've got to start to forge a path to be able to become the man of this house and the man of the family. And so, yeah, I mean, so the transition wasn't hard at all to move countries. We had traveled a fair bit before that anyway, but been in Europe for a big stint. And so that wasn't hard to do.
Okay.
The hardest jump, this is where it gets, the hardest jump for me was answering the call to ministry.
Really? How long had you been? Well, okay. Let me back up.
Yeah.
See, you get to Australia, start working at KPMG. You eventually Ernst & Young. Sorry.
KPMG people.
Ernst & Young, and at some point in there, get connected to Hillsong Church in Australia. How was that immediately, or was that took some time?
I hadn't been to Hillsong Cape Town.
Okay.
Had been to an encounter conference. That's actually where I realized, Hillsong. There's a Hillsong Church in Australia. I hadn't heard a ton about it. I knew the music, but I didn't realize it was actually a church. So I went to Hillsong Cape Town, did a conference there that sparked the move to Australia as well. So when I got there, it was a no-brainer to go, okay, there's that church there.
Yeah.
And it wasn't long between that space where I really felt like I was sitting in a I think it was another conference or young adults thing, and just had this moment with the Lord where I felt like I was called into ministry, which was an outrageous thought for me because I'd never done anything significant in church. I mean, I'd served as a volunteer faithfully. I'd chairs cleaning. I'd served a few years in youth ministry, served a little bit in worship, but never imagined that I'd be the guy who God would call into ministry per se. But the big jump was actually saying yes to that, because I knew that if I said yes to that call, I couldn't fulfill my responsibility and obligation to my family. So for me, there was no, I think ministry's become romanticized today. I don't know if you've picked that up, but like amongst young people, it's like church planting's romanticized, ministry's romanticized, and particularly amongst younger people. But for me, it was never romantic. It was a sacrifice to say yes to the call of God, and it has been ever since.
So how long had you been serving or working before you started sensing?
2 years.
2 years, okay. And what are your next steps then? And I'm asking this in part because there are no doubt some folks listening right now who it may be a call from the marketplace to ministry, from ministry to the marketplace, maybe a different role within the marketplace or a different role within ministry. How did you take next steps once you started sensing a nudge from the Holy Spirit that you were supposed to head towards ministry? What the process of the journey? That you started taking next steps?
Because I'm such a logical person. Like logic prevails over everything. Like if you were to put my logic and emotions non-existent. So it's logic over everything.
Okay.
I know that about myself, that if I sit too long on something I know God's asked me to do, I'll talk myself out of it.
Okay.
So for me, I felt that call. The next day, I had a conversation with one of the partners who thankfully was a believer. So I was able to understand the language I was using. Hey, I can't explain this, but I've had this moment where I feel like I'm called into ministry and I've got to pivot my life. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make any sense. And it's probably the greatest sacrifice I can make, but I have to do it. It's something I have to do. So I handed in my resignation effective immediately.
Oh, is that right?
It was instant. She was gracious enough to keep me on the payroll for a little bit, but it was, I have to do this and I have to do it now. So resigned, and within a week had applied for the college, and started Bible college.
Wow.
And lost that salary.
Yeah.
Which was painful.
And how did you make it work then? Because you're at Hillsong College. So, not only did you lose the salary, but you're actually paying for school all of a sudden.
Paying for school. So, I mean, I'd had pretty large sums saved up because I started working for Ernst & Young while studying. So they were paying for my education, and I was getting a salary as well as some other benefits for being an employee. So I had they pay for my housing too. So I had no expenses and this large salary. So that allowed me to be able to pay for the first 2 years of Bible college. But what also I did was I ended up coming on staff as one of the accountants in the accounting department at Hillsong. So that helped, and did some of the housing stuff as well.
How many times has that happened in Hillsong's history where they bring on somebody to be an accountant and go to ministry school at the same time? Has it ever happened? Have you heard that?
I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised. It's kind of like, I think the Hillsong environment, kind of like I think Engedi environment, you are one of the biggest believers in people. And you don't put any lids on people, at least from what I've seen from you. I think you are a dynamic, big-spirited leader that goes, hey, just because we've never seen it before, it doesn't mean we can't do it. you're a trailblazer. So I think that same environment existed there. So man, we were rewriting scripts over and over again.
Yeah, man, so good.
Yeah.
So how long is the journey at Hillsong? The college, Hillsong College journey?
So 3 years, and then you can, once you finish your 3 years, you can then get into the degree program.
Okay. And how long before you moved from accounting into more of a role that would be more high? It's funny because I don't love the sort of secular sacred distinction, or this is ministry over here because it's teaching and preaching, and this is not because it's accounting. But so however we want to describe that, where you're doing more pastoral work, I'll call it that, as opposed to accounting work.
End of my second year, we were asked to come on staff in a pastoral capacity. So wrapped up the accounting department and pivoted to, we moved from the Hills campus to the city campus downtown. And we were asked to do young adults. So that was my first real ministry experience, was to take over this somewhat dying young adults ministry in the city, which made no sense because we are in the heart of one of the greatest cities on planet Earth. And so I immediately was like, well, it's an opportunity I absolutely would love to take. So I think there's much we can do here. But at the same time, this imposter syndrome going, I have no clue what I'm doing. And I feel like that's been the story of my life. I think God's put me in positions and asked me to step into things that I'd never felt equipped to do, partly because I think he knows my personality. If I put my hand to anything, I'm going to work to become the best at it. And I think that can quickly lead to going, I have this because of me, because I did this and I've worked for it and I'm the best at it. So God's always put me in spaces where it made no sense. And that was one of them. I mean, out of the gate, to step into leading pastoring people after 2 years in Bible college made no sense. But thankfully, you surround yourself with people who see you for who you could be and the potential in you, not where you are. And I've always had that in my mind. And I think that frames my leadership, is to, you think of David. God looked at David while he was a boy and said, he's a man after my own heart. He looked at Abraham before he had any children and called him the father of many nations. I think there's a skill in leadership that I think you possess and I value greatly, is the gift to see something in someone they don't yet see and develop that and release that. And that's one thing I think Hillsong and Brian has always done exceptionally well, is to see the golden people, believe the best in people, and release them into it, and take risks on people. And you are burnt along the way, but I think you'll never, Brian's always said this and it stuck with me, and I'm in the same boat. I'd rather get to heaven and my greatest error be that I believed too much in people.
Oh, that's good.
That was my story. And so that's everything I've ever done.
When you're dealing, I think a lot of people resonate with imposter syndrome. And the funny thing about it, I was reading this just the other day, is this I don't know if he was a social scientist or what, but he was saying even people at the highest levels of leadership still report dealing with heavy amounts of imposter syndrome, where they're at times CEOs of companies, and they still live with that ongoing feeling of like, when are people going to find out I have no,
I don't belong here.
Should not be here. Yeah, I've got no business running this company. So I guess, and I think a lot of people, and by definition, anytime you're stepping into a place you've never been, I mean, by definition, you can't come in with all the cred, all the figured out, all that. So, we're in a tough place because Jesus calls us to step out so we can walk on water. But assuming you haven't walked on water before, you are immediately in a place you've never been. How have you dealt with imposter syndrome over the years?
This is a new thought. So I'm fleshing this out with you here for the first time. So this might not have to make it in there, but we'll see. I'm convinced it's by design, because it's what keeps you dependent, right? I think if you identify it for what it is, God's mechanism into the human DNA, that we never feel like we are where we are because of us. And it keeps you sharp, it keeps you dependent, it keeps you humble. But unredeemed, you then mask up, you then, you're pretentious, you become overly, what's the word I'm looking for? The language I'm looking for. You put on this facade to keep people far enough from actually seeing you that they never catch you in the act. That is it, unredeemed. But I think as a believer, when you see it for what it is, it's what actually keeps you tethered to the cross. Yeah. That's my philosophy on that now. There's no biblical basis for it yet, but I think if I look enough throughout scriptures and even my own life, I've gone, every single person God called, there was always a figurative thought in their flesh that kept them going, I've got to stay here. Yeah. Even David, even when he becomes king, he's crowned king at the lowest point in his life in Ziklag. It is outrageous that was the point that God chose to anoint him as king.
Right.
I think of Paul, like his beginning of his ministry is being laid on by hands by a random man named Ananias in his house. Mm-hmm. And that's the beginning. And he's blind for a while. And so again, God's calling me to something, and now I'm handicapped.
Yeah.
There's Jacob becoming Israel comes out with the hip problem.
Right.
We're handicapped at the beginning of our ministries to remain dependent. I have a friend of mine last week, we were talking in Florida, and he said, hey, I've just had this thought with me that the blessing of God comes when we're broken. God breaks, think of the breaking of the bread. The greatest blessing comes in the breaking. Mm-hmm. We don't want to be broken, and that's where we miss out on the blessing. But if we truly want to walk in the fullness of what God has for us, we have to allow him to break us. Yeah. That keeps you dependent. Oh. So that's a thought. It's a new thought, brand new thought.
Yeah.
But I think that's how I've begun to deal with them. I don't even call it imposter syndrome anymore. I used to, but now I just call it walking by faith.
That's what it is.
And what better place to be than every day to wake up going, God, I need you. And I remember I can't remember who it was. I'm in so many conversations. I don't read books a lot. I'm a conversationalist. I talk to people who read books and take their tacit knowledge.
Yeah.
But he said, you're free falling right now. I felt like we were just out of the church. We were just, man, I was out here. It felt like walking on water wasn't the perfect description. I felt like we had jumped into a boat without a parachute. Mm-hmm. And he just said, don't ever hit the ground. Stay in that posture. I know it feels scary. I know it feels like, man, when's the rubber going to hit the road? I'm going to hit the cement and this whole thing's going to come crashing down. He goes, God's good enough to keep you flying. Just keep going. Don't try to reach for land.
That's so good. I was reading the other day, and I shared this with Christina. I was reading a couple different passages in Scripture that are parables where Jesus talks about when the master leaves for a while and then leaves us in charge, a manager in charge, and he basically says it's easy to start getting into this mode where you think, hey, the master's away representing Jesus. I'm going to have fun. I'm going to take it easy. I'm going to enjoy life, et cetera, et cetera. And he said, blessed is the person who, when the master comes back, you're doing the same thing he's called you to do. And I was saying to Christina, the thing with our American version of retirement is I feel like it's you work X number of years, and then after that, and this is what the words in the first parable that I was reading in Luke say, eat, drink, and be merry. It's eat, drink, and be merry after that. And I said to Christina,
I think the next verse is for tomorrow we die.
Right. Well, and it's like, I said to her, you read these texts and you go, man, God's never really calling us to say, well, I did my time. Yeah. And I get there's a space where you can slow down a bit and all those things, fine. But the idea that I just chill and have fun, I thought, man, I think God's continuing to invite us to step out in the water. Yep. And I feel like
to live
as we get older, we're going to have to keep, hopefully on the one hand, it gets easier from the standpoint of we've stepped out on the water enough times that it's not such a freak out. Yep. But on the flip side, I think that it feels like the gravitational pull of age is to be comfortable and kind of exist in a place of, okay, I've got this now. And man, I just was saying to Christina, we've got to fight that. We have got to fight that pull that just says, I kind of do what we're good at. We got the vibe. We know what we're doing. Because I think you're right. I think we're made to keep stretching. Keeps us dependent. Keeps our relationship with God alive.
Yeah, I've had this phrase going through my head the last couple of months, maybe a couple of years, to be certainly uncertain and comfortably uncomfortable. That, I think, is that sweet spot of a believer. No matter your age, is to be certainly uncertain. We are certain in him and uncertain in where we are. But as long as we have him, then it doesn't matter the uncertainty around us because he's the constant. Yeah. So I'm certainly uncertain. And it's become the joke in my household because it's like, well, I'll say, I think we should be doing this next with our church or our lives or our finances. And he goes, are you sure? And I go, I'm certainly uncertain.
That's faith right there. Certainly uncertain. Well, you start out as young adults, which is where I started too as young adults pastor. It's such a fun season of life to be able to walk with people. Although I had some early nights where it was like, God, what are you doing putting me in this spot? But thankfully, I think that's part of the journey of maturity is trusting him. Yeah. But then you ended up, I don't know how many different roles you had. You ended up with
a number of different roles.
Okay, you ended up in the online, like the pastor over online ministries, or what was the?
No. I mean, that would be the mistake of the century. The least tech-savvy person ever. So young adults then took over youth and young adults, inherited youth as well. For all the city campuses, and then we took on as well evening college. We took on all the PM services, all the night services across the city locations.
Okay.
Then we took on some campus stuff and then some state stuff. So it was we just kept adding. I think at one point between my wife and I, we had about 7 departments between the two of us that we were running, which was fun.
Yeah.
But
well, what was when I see you preaching, like you were doing online messages?
Oh, well, that was COVID. COVID, when we pivoted to COVID, I was on it. I mean, that was one of the scariest things in my life because that was our entire church represented on that one stream.
So they didn't. So the campuses had their own, like you recorded your own message per campus. It wasn't just the broadcast.
Pre-pandemic, each campus had local speakers in-house, and Brian was around. We'd all watch that. During the pandemic, most of our entire stream as a church across Australia was that one stream.
Okay.
And so that was what was nerve-wracking. I'd never spoken to our entire church across the country and then globally.
Right.
And so that was why that was nerve-wracking. It's like, oh, this is something new.
Yeah.
And new to online.
Yeah.
Like it was there's only a handful of us who ever actually got to do that.
Wow.
And I was honored to do it. But again, one of those situations you go, I don't belong here,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, you did great though. I watched several of those messages and I thought, wow, I didn't know that. That's the funny thing about also when you step out, sometimes you're so in your head about what am I doing? I've never done this before, et cetera. And then as you just step out and walk in faith, even if you feel uncertain, sometimes, I feel like most of the time, honestly, the people around you are like, I would have never known. And so bless God for that.
Bless God for it.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about Hillsong. Obviously, Hillsong as a movement's had a couple tough years here. Right. I don't know. I just would be curious to hear any reflections you have, having been real close, and then having seen some of Hillsong's just recent journey. Any reflections you've had on that?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this for a long, long time. I'll answer this question by working in to out. I think internally, I think there's great lessons there to be learned about accountability. I think one of the biggest things, I won't speak too much in detail about the intricate details of each failure of leadership, whether it be Brian or the board or Carl or whatever all the stories were. I think just in a broad stroke, I'd go, I think the lesson there was the value of accountability. I think is the first thing you think, who's holding them accountable? But I realized something about accountability through the whole thing is like you are only as accountable to the degree you're willing to be vulnerable and open. So accountability still, if our only threshold or our only safeguard against a life of sin is the accountability structures we set up, I still think that's flawed. So it's had me think through what else do I need to build into my life outside of just relying on my accountability structures. Again, they only can speak back into what I expose to them and to the degree with which I'm willing to listen to feedback. So it really, again, put an emphasis back to me on the importance of the fear of the Lord. I think if we fight more than setting up great governance structures, which are important, more than setting up good accountability systems, which are important, more than setting up good safeguards around your daily practices, which are important, I think our highest pursuit should be continuing to fight to remain in a posture of a genuine fear of the Lord. The God shall not be mocked. And if we fight for that above all else, and it's funny because you go to like men's conferences, not yours, because yours was amazing. I need to talk to him more about that. But you go to like men's conferences or even like youth summer camps, the boys and girls session. We talk about the accountability. We talk about the structures, the behaviors, but we never talk about you'll never fall in sin if you stay at the feet of Jesus and you remain in awe. Like we have become, I think, at times too familiar with the Lord. He is still the maker of the heavens and the earth. This magnificent, all-glorious Alpha and Omega, the Lord of heaven's armies. I mean, this is who in one breath brought into existence the entirety of this earth and in one moment can end it all. That is who we're dealing with. And I think we can keep that awe and wonder. I think that will always keep us on the straight and narrow.
Yeah.
And so that was one of the biggest lessons I learned, is going, and I realized it because even in setting up our own lives, I've had all the structures, but I actually got, what structure have I built in my life to keep me centered and focused on the magnitude and wonder of who God is and fear of the Lord.
Oh, it's so good. It's so good in part because I know situations where people have had all the proper and healthy governance.
Yeah.
And it really, I mean, if somebody wants to hide stuff, they can hide stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just the way it is.
So,
and so there has to be this deep internal thing that says, before God,
right,
I want to be in the right place in all aspects, and not even just in things I do. It all starts, we just talked about this morning here at Engedi, but it all starts from what's going on inside your heart. I've got to have such regard for the holiness of God and His presence in my life that I can't violate it. I think you're right. I think we've gotten too casual. I think that sometimes, we neither of us could be bigger fans of grace.
Yeah.
But sometimes it feels like people have taken the idea and reality of grace and almost made it this very comfortable sort of, God's just good with whatever because Jesus died and all that.
Yeah, where sin abounds, grace abounds, so I can just keep on sinning. No,
grace
is not given as an excuse to keep on sinning.
Right, and so I think that word of, and just the idea of not mocking God, I think is such a big deal. It's such good perspective. Now, I'm guessing on the balance, you have probably taken, sometimes people experience a leader or something like you had at Hillsong happen, and it's just dismantles them so significantly. Tell me this. I'm guessing that I know the answer is that your takeaway from Hillsong and even from some of the leaders that hit some bumps is far greater than maybe what you felt was lost in that. I don't know. How do you process that?
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think it's also framed a lot of my conversations because I think people, I to some degree, without casting judgment, I lack respect for people who are willing to cast aside everything that is good over the failure of a few. And that has been something I've even really been enlightened to, is we talk about, you think about what happened at Hillsong, it really was maybe a handful of people. If you were to stretch it out, you go maybe 12, 15 people probably lay at the center of blame, didn't do what they were meant to be doing, failure here, no accountability, no acceptance of remorse or repentance and so forth. 15 people. But if we truly believe the church is the collective body, every single person, I just found myself going, we indicted the church, Hillsong Church, over the actions of a few. And I'm sitting there going, if you don't know Hillsong Church, you just think of the entity and you'll indict the whole thing. But for me, Hillsong Church was a Jocelyn, who was one of our amazing, young adult leaders. When I think Hillsong Church, I think of Grace, who was one of the young girls in our youth ministry. I think of Manu, who found his calling and purpose. I think of, for me, I started to think through the people, and I thought, we've just indicted an entire community of people. And we go, Hillsong Church this, Hillsong. They had nothing to do with it. The tens of thousands of people around the globe who called Hillsong Church home became indicted of the actions of a few. And when you start to see the church like that, and I remember getting so convinced, going, man, I've done that. You've seen things happen. Willow Creek or whatever it is, and you want to click the bait and you want to talk about Willow and you want to talk. And I realized, man, we talk so flippantly about the church, but that's actually people. And the church should never be reduced to one or a few people. So my whole perspective has shifted entirely on how I respond to church scandal. I now see the people. I now see the individuals, the single moms who finally found a place where they can grow in their walk with God. The families who have, kids with additional needs and who have finally found a place where their kids can be taken care of and they can actually encounter the Lord. It's a place where drug addicts have come off the streets and were at rock bottom, near death, and God has delivered them. It's the place where the young, youth student who has struggled with so many things, anxiety, depression, suicidal, comes and finds hope. That, to me, is who we talk about when we talk about Hillsong Church.
Yeah.
Now it changes how you talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's been a big lesson for me, and what has framed a lot of my conversation. And so I will stand by it. I am proud of what I was a part of because I saw the fruit. I saw the life change. I saw the countless volunteers who gave of their gifts, their time, their energy, their resources to build God's house and lived out what we see in Scripture. I saw Acts 2:42 take place. I saw the development. I saw the millions of dollars that went to communities of people who will never step foot out through our doors, but we did it anyway because that's the gospel. Yeah. So for me, I also know what it did for me personally. I am not who I am without the kind of place that saw me in light. I did not see myself, believed in me enough to give me a shot and develop me and champion me and my wife, considering there are still churches today that don't believe women should do anything in ministry. There is so much rich history. The songs, the expression of worship, to give the body of Christ at large language to talk about the magnitude and beauty of who God is. The influence is insurmountable. I will not discard that flippantly over the actions of 15 people in comparison to the hundreds upon hundreds of thousands, maybe even the millions of people who've been impacted by what God did to the people of Hillsong Church.
Yeah, I think that's a great word and a great view. I just, we'll have no idea this side of eternity, the level of impact that Hillsong has made. And I just, it's been such, I know Hillsong's influenced me as a leader in our church, but I know so many churches and pastors and lay people would say the same. One of the things that's cool about your journey is, and you kind of got this a little bit ago when you were talking about just persevering and bringing your best work to whatever the situation is, but just the general theme of resilience.
Right.
And that is such a big deal. I think that, and I don't know if it's, we like to place a lot of blame at social media, and sometimes it's pretty well placed. Sometimes maybe not. I don't know. But sometimes I think people want something they see in that picture. Mm-hmm. And don't realize what it took to make that picture possible.
Yep. And if you did, you might not want it.
Right. Totally. And so you've had to be resilient. Tell me about how that's played out in your life.
I mean, I feel like my whole life's message would be encapsulated in these two words: go again. It's become now the word for our year for our church. It has framed a lot of my life. You think through the New Testament, most of Paul's writings. I don't know the exact percentage, but I think north of 60% of Paul's writing addresses suffering. The entirety of the book of Hebrews was written for that purpose, to encourage and exhort the believers to remain steadfast in the confident hope they find in Christ Jesus. Corinthians echoes that. There's evidence of that in Thessalonians. There's evidence of that in Philippians. I mean, my God, the entire book of Philippians is... So you look at the vast majority of writings in the New Testament which encourage the body of Christ who are going through persecution, suffering, many of them considering, do I return back to what was? So it gave me a picture of going, well, if the vast majority of the early church endured much suffering and persecution, and even Christ says, if I endured persecution, what makes you think you won't be? So I think it's been a theme of my life, and I've now found language for it in my own personal life. It's become my life's message because I realized this is going to mark the life of any believer who wants to do anything significant for the kingdom. Mm-hmm. Because as you and I know, nothing worth doing and nothing worth having doesn't come without cost. And so we then have to make a decision to go, well, if God is going to be the constant, God will fulfill his promises. I'm the one who can shift. I have to get in my heart solidified in the conviction of going, I'm not going to quit because I know God won't quit on me. And again, it comes back to, I think a lot of times I felt like I've stepped into rooms and stepped into roles because I was simply the last man standing. I've never been the brightest. I've never been the most gifted necessarily. I've never been the best in everything, but I've remained steadfast. And again, it goes all the way back to my upbringing. If I had quit, I felt like a community of people who we lived around and I did life with would have indicted every black person they knew as quitters because I felt the weight of going, I represent something bigger than myself. And that too is true about our faith. Now as we become the people of God, I identify more with my faith as a person of God than I do my heritage and culture because I'm now in kingdom. I've been adopted into the family of Christ. So now I embody and I represent something far greater than my family heritage. So if I didn't quit at that point because I was representing my family, how much more that I'm representing the kingdom? And so that has just shaped everything. And to be honest, you need it. You need it. to accomplish anything significant. And church planting, you know this, you need it in church planting. We've had 65 no's before we found our church building. And I think through even it personally in our family, miscarriages before we saw the blessing of children. I think through many failed attempts at things I thought the Lord was asking us to do and tried and failed. This life is geared towards us having to persevere and endure. And I think it's a valuable lesson to learn.
I totally agree with that. When you think, and you've already referenced some of these, when you think, so maybe that you've already mentioned what you'll answer to this question, but when you think of one or two challenges that you've personally had to walk through and practice resilience to its fullest, what one or two come to mind as these were the battles of the battles that I had to get through?
Sheesh. I'll work the most recent, definitely the church plant for sure.
In what regard?
The level of opposition, the level of obstacles, the personal battles you face, when you embark, I'll get into some of the details in that, but when you embark on anything, you will come under attack in a significant way. So my confidence, I had I did half the time I've had any season of depression, I didn't know I was having it at the time because I'm just so focused on getting out of it. But depression in a deep, deep way in the early stages of our church, dealing with disappointment in the early stages. There were people we had heard it, we were told that was going to happen, but you just don't believe it'll happen to you. But the people who you think will be with you and the people who think will get behind you don't show up, and having to navigate that disappointment, unmet expectations. I think you come into church planting, particularly when you come from a place like Hillsong Church, and you think, "Oh, we're going to do this. It's going to look like that." And then you now face the reality of what is in front of you. There's a dissonance between what you see and what you had in your heart, and having to figure out how you encourage others while you walk through your own disappointments and you walk through your own failed and unmet expectations. So I'd say those are some of the hardest. The most recent would be the early stages of the church plant. And then going, man, I thought God called us to this, but everywhere we go, everyone's telling us no because we're a church.
Specifically about location.
Specifically about finding a building for our church. So that is the most recent. I think this church planting is definitely, without a doubt, been the hardest thing I've ever had to do. It's taken its toll on me. I felt like David and Ziklag, absolutely defeated when they go fight one battle, they come back and the village has been pillaged, and he's got his own disappointment he's dealing with, and then people start turning on him as well, his own companions. So it's all that kind of stuff. I think earlier in life, I'd say the loss of my mother, that was hard. And it was only a few years after I started Bible college. I think it was in that first year of Bible college. So I've just made one of the hardest decisions of my life to sacrificially answer the call of God. And the first thing that happens is the death of my most important figure in my life. So I flew back to South Africa, and I had all these voices around me going, you can't go back to Australia. You need to be in a support system. You got to stay here with us. And I had to wrestle going, that actually is sound wisdom, to stay in community, to stay in a support system, which I had a stronger one in South Africa than I did in Australia, in one of the hardest and deepest losses of my life. And wrestling with what made sense naturally and sound wisdom versus the call of God. And having to fight through all those emotions to keep getting up and saying, I'm going to answer the call, and I'm going to get back on that plane, and I'm going to go back to Australia, and I'm going to keep doing what God said to do. Those would be the two, I think, signature times. Those are things that I've had to be resilient more than anything, where I every part of my body and my bones wanted to call it quits.
Yeah, and it's funny as you say that, because number one, thankfully, when God gives us a calling, as He did you for ministry and then ultimately to plant, it's a clear enough calling in your heart that you know you can't.
He ruins you for anything else. You're ruined.
You just know that that's what He's called you to. But it's funny, as much as you said earlier that you're a logical person by nature, it is interesting in those moments, all those emotions come up of the feelings of obligation, guilt, fear, you name it. Common sense with regard to the people around us versus what I feel like is the call of God. All of these things come with powerful, powerful emotions, and that's where I feel like resiliency is it really is, at least in my mind, it feels a lot like an emotional battle to stay strong on the inside when there are these forces that are just pushing back. When you were facing those kinds of opposition moments as you were planting SOZO City, did you have any particular strategies that you were using to try to navigate the moments where you felt really defeated, really overwhelmed with, this is just so far from what I imagined, we keep getting no's, I've not had people that have not stepped up I thought were going to? Was it just, I know he called me, or were there other things you did to just kind of keep your head straight, or how did you do it?
The phrase "go again" comes from 1 Kings 19, the story of Elijah and this servant who says, keep going back. The servant says, there's nothing. You go back 7 times. There's a cloud the size of a man's hand. That has been the blueprint for me of how to endure and to keep pressing on. Because if you don't go back a chapter, you don't realize that the drive within Elijah to keep telling the servant to go again wasn't the internal dialogue. It was the word that God said in 1 Kings 18, that he would bring rain. Mm-hmm. Elijah was able to have that resilience and that faith to believe that God will come through because he said it. That has been what has, so for me, the decision to not stay in South Africa from my past was because God said. And the decision to persevere with the church plant in the face of all kinds of opposition was because God said. Faith comes by hearing and hearing by the word. I built my faith not on what I saw, even in my mind's eye. I built my faith not on my dreams. I built my faith not on my own skill sets or my own ability. Because that's also the temptation, is like, I'll grind it out. Mm-hmm. Well, what happens when you have nothing left to grind? So my entire faith and the basis for my resilience is built on the word. So if there is no word, I don't go, because I won't have it in the tank to sustain the tough seasons. Yeah. So go on a word. That's been me. Yeah. Go on a word. And if you have that word, it's alive. And one of the things I taught on this is, Elijah says there is the sound of abundance of rain, but no one else could hear it. And I began to realize that the sound he heard of rain was, again, a confirmation of the word he had heard. But I had this moment, this thought of, by the time we hear something, it means something's already transpired. Sound is never the sign of the beginning of something. It's a sign that something's already happened. So I used the illustration in Chicago, man, if you hear a gunshot, you fine. Because if you can hear it, it happened a while ago. Yeah. By the time you hear it, that bullet's gone. Mm-hmm. So if you could hear it, you're still good. And so it began to become this confirmation again of going, if it works in sound and science, it's true of God's character too, that by the time God speaks it, it's already in motion. I'd have to stick around long enough to see it come to pass.
Well, I love that. And I think that it was at a conference just recently, and one of the speakers was saying he did all the studying of revivals and whatnot, and he said every revival, every major move of God started with somebody who could say, thus saith the Lord, when God said to me, like not a chapter and verse quotation, but they heard something from God that motivated them to action. And that's what I hear you saying is, I'm operating out of faith because I've heard something, and now I am, I'm committed, one foot in front of the other, because I cannot deny his voice.
And some people go, that's dangerous, because what happens if you mishear God? What happens how do you know it was God? How do you know it wasn't your ambition? And I go, to be honest, my frame of reference is God is sovereign enough that even if I get it wrong, he'll make it good. And he's big enough that if I'm genuinely wrong, he'll close the door and he'll pivot my life. So there was a couple of buildings where I thought, man, that's the one. Like, I think and I was like, man, I really feel my spirit that might be it. And I went for it. I thought that was what we heard. And we got no after no after no. And God was sovereign enough to close all the wrong doors to open up this one. Do you know the building we're in now is exponentially better than any of the 65 we went and approached?
Is that right? Wow.
God is sovereign enough. Do I believe in the sovereignty of God enough that even when I get it wrong, he's good enough to make it right?
Man, that's such a good word. And hopefully somebody right now is encouraged because they are knocking on door 30 or door 45, and you never know when the 65th is coming. That's the yes.
And I also want to encourage a person who's stuck, paralyzed by, I don't know. Too many guys are stuck, paralyzed. not making any decisions at all because they are fearful of making the wrong one. God can't order your steps if you're not walking. He orders the steps of the righteous. He guides the steps. So it's like you've got to walk for God to guide. I hope, yes, encourage a person. Man, if you're at 30, you've just fine. You keep going. You're 25 better than most people. But I really pray that it encourages the person who has been stuck, paralyzed, too afraid to make the wrong decision, that God's big enough.
I love this phrase that a friend of mine said years back when we were just starting Engedi, and I have, certain phrases, they just, I don't know, I think God puts them in your heart and keeps them there for a reason, but he kept saying, he would love to say, God can't steer a parked car. Have you heard this phrase before? No. God can't steer a parked car. And I have come back to that phrase in my heart so many times, just saying, on the one hand, it's this whole balance and maybe we might even say tension between listening and activity or taking action. On the one hand, I deeply am prayerful. I mean, I spend significant time listening to God, journaling, spend time His Word, all that. But I feel like there is a biblical case to be made. I am biased towards action. I'm biased towards doing something. Sometimes maybe doing something is prayer, and that's it for that time. But I think more often than not, there is something even more than prayer that's just some kind of moving forward. And as I give God more to work with, He starts steering.
That's exactly right. It's how do you prove your faith genuine unless it's tested? And how is it tested if you don't get out there and just take that first step? So there is a biblical evidence for that to some degree. Now it's a stretch a little bit, but I think the principle remains there is you have to move. You have to. In fact, as I'm talking now, I'm realizing there's actually greater biblical bias toward what we're saying. Every miracle that God did in healing in the New Testament and the Gospels involved a person doing something. You have to move.
Well, and I was thinking, as you were saying that, I was thinking of Moses when they're asking for a sign that God is going to lead them to the promised land or get them to the promised land. And God's basic answer is, the sign will be when you get there. Well, thanks a lot for that.
You.
I was looking for something a little bit more present moment, but the reality was God was saying, "Hey, you keep taking steps in faith, day after day after day after day, and one day you're going to wake up in the promised land, and that will be the day you go." Yeah, it turns out that we had a promise this whole time.
Man, right or wrong, one of the things of the last was 2019 when someone said it to me then, and it stuck with me since, and I just now also apply it to my life, just in general. You're blessed to the left, and you're blessed to the right. Go.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. He's going to work with it.
That is liberating to go, really, man, God goes ahead of me anyway. So if I go to the left and I go to the right, it's in with Lot and Abraham, God is going to bless whichever way Abraham went. And as long as our hearts remain tethered to Him.
That's it.
And that was the thing for me, is going, okay, cool. I'm not going to be timid. We've not been given a spirit of timidity. So I'm not going to be timid. I'm going to go for broke, and I'm going to go for it, and I'm going to believe that God will either breathe on it, bless it, or He'll close it and give me something better.
And even if He closes it and gives you something better, that whole journey is ultimately still going to be such an expression of His favor and grace. That is where it is just so good, and I think that'll be a good word to start heading towards close on here. Is just such a good word for the person out there. It's so easy to get paralyzed when you're trying to figure out what's next, what move should I make? And sometimes literally people are asking geographic moves. Should I go here or should I go there? Should I go to that school or should I go to this school? My heart is, if I was a college student today or a high school student looking to go to, say, college, and I had two great schools, I am praying. I am saying, Lord, I am open to whatever you want. And I'm not hearing the Lord say, go here or go there. I am going to just know in my spirit, I'm going to ask God, which one am I most passionate about, which seemed the best? And if I don't sense that He's saying this or that, I'm going to make a call and trust He goes with me. And
just make a call.
To your point, it was somehow the wrong call, I trust in the providence and the grace and the kindness of God. He's going to help me figure that out. And that helps me just keep moving and not get paralyzed by indecision, overanalysis, and such things.
And what you just reminded me of something I remember hearing. Every decision is a comma. we treat everything like it's a full stop. Like this decision is the final one. Like everything hinges on this next decision.
Yeah.
If I get it wrong, that's game over. No, every next decision is a comma until the day you die. And I think through the times in my life, there are things that God has had me take a next step on that I thought was the final destination, but God was using that to actually get me where he wanted me, because he knew it was too big of a leap to get me from where I was to where so for instance, the church plant, when we left Australia, I had thought, because again, logic, what we needed, what we didn't have, what we weren't equipped for, I said, maybe we're 5 years away. Like that, I'll plan for that to be 5 years. I had this plan of what we're going to do. So we left Australia with a very distinct, what I felt like was our next step. And if it wasn't that, I was never leaving, you know? And I thought that was definitive. Like that was our thing for the next 5 years. That was what God used to get me out of Australia, because he knew I was never going to leave any other way. And that actually was the comma that led to us going, well, actually, I think the church is now. But I would have never done that. I would have never left Australia straight to starting a church if it were up to me. So everything's a comma until the day you die.
Anything else, Lungz, you'd like to share today?
Well, I love the name of the podcast. I think if our target audience is people who are on here, it's because you really feel like there's things God's calling you to do. Made to advance. You are made to advance. So get up and go again. If you've tried once, if you've tried 10 times or 100 times and it's failed, go again. If you are still waiting for the right timing, the right amount of money in your bank account, the right opportunity, the right door, it's never coming. Get up and go. So that's my last is you were made to advance. So do it.
Well, it's a great word to end on. I am so grateful for your friendship. I believe Chicago, Illinois is profoundly blessed by the presence of your fam and your church. And I feel like it's a massive gift of God to my life that we get to be locking arms together, advancing the kingdom. And it's so fun to have a great friend across the pond, as we say. And I look forward to many, many, many more years and many conversations of partnership and lifting up Jesus' name and seeing people's lives change. So thank you for being on today, and look forward to having you back sometime soon.
Boom.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Lungz as much as I did. I really just so relish every single moment I get to spend with Pastor Lungz, and especially his comments today on what it means to move forward and to move forward confidently. I love that phrase, whether you turn to the right or you turn to the left, you know you will be blessed if you're walking in Christ. So we don't need to be paralyzed by, am I doing the right thing? Should I move over here? Should I go straight? No, we're going to walk in Christ, and we're going to move forward as best we can in faith and know God is with us. And that is such a great encouragement. It's really what this entire podcast is all about. So if you were encouraged by our conversation today, please rate and review us. That helps us get the word out about our podcast. And this has been a production of Engedi Church. We've got more incredible conversations coming your direction, so stay tuned for more. And until next time, just know you were made to advance.